So far we have taken for granted that the dual process theory of instrumental action, which distinguishes goal-directed and habitual processes, is true. But we shouldn't take for granted that that is true. We should rather consider the evidence. For although I think the evidence for this theory is so solid as to be unlikely that you could refute it, it would be a legitimate target of attack for the long essay on your course. And in any case, you need to know what kind of evidence might support the theory. That's actually a core part of what we're trying to achieve on this course, to get you to connect a bold theoretical idea with some philosophical consequences, with some scientific discoveries. All right. So the theory says, as you remember, that instrumental behaviour itself involves two systems, the goal-directed and the habitual. That's what the dual process theory of instrumental action says in essence. So what we want, of course, is to work out what are the predictions of the theory and how strongly are those predictions supported by evidence. And what you notice is that there are a variety of factors which are supposed to influence the goal-directed and habitual processes, which in turn are supposed to then influence instrumental action. Here's the cool thing though, not all of those factors influence the two processes equally. If you take, for example, cognitive load, we would expect cognitive load to have a very significant effect on the goal-directed processes, which after all involve greater complexity cognitively, because you have to weigh up your preferences and also your representations of contingencies between actions and outcomes, compared to the habitual processes where what you're really doing is just weighing up how strong the relation between stimulus is and the various actions that you might perform. The strongest action wins. So you might think that cognitive load would have almost no effect on habitual processes, but potentially quite a significant one on goal-directed processes. So here's a kind of cool idea. Suppose that we had a way to manipulate cognitive load. For example, by stressing people out. If we make people kind of stressed, then cognitive load goes up. And in that case, what we should see is that the goal-directed processes struggle. The goal-directed processes should struggle because of the increasing cognitive load from other things, the stress, that's preventing you from doing such a good job here. So the influence of the habitual processes should be stronger. Okay, now here's a second thought. If the influence of the habitual processes is stronger, what would we expect to happen in response to devaluation? Devaluation, as you remember, is reducing your preference for a particular object all of a sudden. Well, the habitual process should be largely unaffected by devaluation because that's largely unaffected by your preferences, whereas the goal-directed process will be. So if we increase cognitive load, we should reduce the effect of the goal-directed processes, thereby making devaluation less important in changing instrumental action. That's what we're predicting. So with the dual process theory, an increase in cognitive load will mean that devaluation makes a smaller change on your instrumental actions than it would do if cognitive load were, if you were not under such high cognitive load, if you were not, for example, stressed. All right, so let's make this concrete with an example. So here's our prediction. Increasing stress levels will reduce the influence of your preferences so that devaluation will not have such a great impact on your choice of action to perform. And the evidence for the truth of this prediction comes from a lovely study by Schwaber and Wolf. So let me take you through, this is quite complicated. I want to take you, the diagram is quite complicated, the study is beautifully simple. I want to take you through just this bottom left-hand side first. So here you are in the training part of the study, and you're presented with a screen and it's got two shapes on the screen. This is designed so that it can be done by small children as well as adults. And what you don't know is that if you tap one of the shapes, let's say it's the circle in your case, there's a 50-50 chance that you will get a chocolate drink and a 0.2 chance that you will get some peppermint tea. If you press the triangle, there's a 0.2 chance that you will get peppermint tea. Right. And otherwise nothing will happen. So whichever button you press, it's possible that nothing will happen, and it's also possible, small chance, 1 in 5 times you're going to get some peppermint tea. The difference between the two buttons is just that with the circle, every other time you press it, we would expect you to get the rewarding chocolate drink, and that's not the case with the triangle. So in the training phase, you're just given the opportunity to explore. So you press a button, you can keep pressing buttons. And the supposition is that over time, you will actually learn the contingencies, right? So that's the chocolate milk version. There is also another version where the reward is not the chocolate milk, but now orange juice again. So again, with the funny shape, you've got 50-50 chance of getting orange juice and a 1 in 5 chance of getting peppermint tea, otherwise you get nothing. Here you've got a 1 in 5 chance of peppermint tea, otherwise nothing. And then finally there's a condition where the reward is just the peppermint tea. Or it's just water. It's just water. As a kind of control condition. So you've got this training setup where you learn about the contingency between the buttons and the outcomes. Then you're divided into two groups. So one half of you, this side of the room, if you were here in the lecture, is going to be put under some stress. And the way that the experimenter Schwalbe and Wolf did that in this case was by giving you a kind of social questionnaire where you kind of feel like bad about how other people are evaluating you. So pretty stressful. And the other side of people don't get that stressful experience. So you get another questionnaire to do. It should be quite similar, but it's not stressful because you're not socially evaluated. Now in the third part, this is the part of the experiment where we want to observe what happens. We devalue one of these substances. So let's say that we devalue the chocolate. Of course, everything has to be nicely counterbalanced. So let's say that we have devalued the chocolate. In that case, if your actions are governed by the goal-directed process, we would expect you here to be selecting the water. But in the orange juice case, that hasn't been devalued, so we'd still be expecting you to select the orange juice as much as you were before, in this case, assuming you like orange juice. However, that would be true for those groups that are not placed under stress. But if you're in the stressed out group, then we predict something different. We predict that if you're in the stressed out group, the influence of the goal-directed processes on your action is now being reduced. So the devaluation will also have less effect. So what we might think is that you're going to be selecting the chocolate about as much as you're selecting the orange, right? The devaluation will make almost no effect. So do you see how beautiful the design of this study is? Because we can compare the chocolate milk, which has been devalued, with the orange juice, which hasn't been devalued, we're in a lovely position here. What we might see is, look, stressing you out just reduces your performance generally. So you're pressing these buttons less often and you're just less happy to participate. But we can still think of the effect of devaluation as the difference between what you do with the chocolate milk, which has been devalued, and the orange juice, which hasn't been devalued. We can still compare those two things, and we can compare that difference, the difference between devalued and non-devalued in you who was stressed, with the same difference, the difference between devalued and non-devalued, in you who was not stressed. So in short, the prediction of the dual process theory is that when you're not stressed, the difference between devalued and valued will be greater than when you are stressed. Complicated, but also very elegant. So let's see what the results were. The control group, so you're not being stressed. What you can see here in the last 15 trials, luckily subjects are choosing the valued and the devalued about equally, right? So the chocolate milk and the orange juice are well chosen rewards because people apparently are finding them roughly as rewarding. And then the control group, one of these things is devalued, right? I think I'm going to say chocolate milk, but of course that was counterbalanced, divided into subgroups. The chocolate milk was devalued, and so you can see here that people are selecting the chocolate milk less often. It's not that it's gone altogether, but it's quite different from what was happening in the last 15 trials. And the devalued thing, the chocolate milk, is quite different from the still valued orange juice. But you can see right away here on the stressed group, things are very similar in the last 15 trials before the devaluation, but the devaluation there is making no difference. It's making no difference. If anything, people in the stress group are picking the devalued thing more than they were before. Oh, I forgot to tell you how we devalued it. You want to know how we devalued it. That's great. Very good question. In this case, we just got people to drink themselves to satiety. That's what Schwalbe and Wolf did. They just got them to drink loads and loads of chocolate milk till it was no longer attractive to them. So you just had like absolutely as much as you can of the chocolate milk. And in that situation, most people, just like in the control group, are going to be like, whew, Time for some orange juice. Really had a lot of that chocolate milk. But of course, in the stress group, it doesn't work like that. So there's a very important lesson from this actually, which is when stressed, your preferences matter less and your habits dominate. When stressed, you might do things which are actually for you not pleasurable at all, because for example, you've become sated on the chocolate milk, but you're still going to drink it. So go easy on yourself, right? As a human being, often when you're stressed, you're not actually performing that well. You're not making great choices, right? Very interesting thing to know as a practical matter. But our concern, of course, is with evidence. How is any of this evidence for the dual process theory of instrumental action? Now, I have kind of already answered that question. The point was that we had a prediction, and the prediction was that if we increase cognitive load by making people stressed, we will reduce the effect of the goal-directed processes and increase the effect of the habitual processes on the instrumental action. But as you know, the habitual processes are more or less impervious to your current preferences and are therefore largely unaffected by devaluation. So the dual process theory predicts, and no comparable theory can make the same prediction, no interestingly different theory can make the same prediction. The dual process theory predicts that the increase in cognitive load will mean that devaluation is less effective than when cognitive load is not impaired, right? When we don't add cognitive load on people. You can't really impair cognitive load. Sorry, what you're impairing is cognition. And the way that you're doing that is by adding cognitive load, for example, stress. So the real prediction, I should say, is this. Higher cognitive load, devaluation is less effective. Lower cognitive load, devaluation more effective. That's the prediction. And we've just seen that Schwalbe and Wolf provide evidence for that prediction. Well done them. Oh, that's really good. Now, if you're struggling with that, what I'd advise you to do is just go back and take a look at the paper or review some of the video. Just make sure you understand that one study. If you haven't got that, if that doesn't make sense to you, it won't help you to go and think about more evidence, right? That will just only add to your confusion. And although as a philosopher, of course, I think confusion is good. It's a productive and essential part of gaining insights. In this case, I think you actually want to understand that first. So feel free to stop at this point and go no further. That's absolutely fine. You only really need to understand one piece of evidence, and if you can do that, you've really made great progress. On the other hand, if you're just totally happy, right, you've come from psychology and this is, baby steps for you, that's great. Let's have a look at some more evidence. And if this is too slow, right, just go and read the papers. That's great too. Right, so we want some more evidence, and the evidence now is going to come from a different manipulation, which is to do, the previous one was to do with the way the preferences are structured, and now we're going to change how the action outcome representations are structured via training. But in order to explain this, I want to introduce you to some background. So this is kind of like stepping away, we're doing a bit of an aside, and the question is, can we see in young children around about their first birthday evidence that their behaviours are already goal-directed? Can we see that? So we know that we find goal-directed behaviours in a wide variety of animals, including famously rats. Can we find them in young children? Well, one way to test that would be to give them a choice between watching two video clips, right? So I guess we're not really allowed to give them chocolate milk and that kind of thing at this tender age. So here they are in Klosek and Dickinson's experiment, and if they press the butterfly on the left, they get to see one video clip, and if they press the butterfly on the right, they get to see another video clip. Now, here's a thought. If their behaviour is narrowly habitual, that's to say dominated by habitual processes, and goal-directed processes either don't occur in them or play very little role, then we would expect that devaluing one of the video clips should have little effect on their actions. By contrast, if we think that their actions are influenced by goal-directed processes, then devaluing one of the video clips will cause them much more often to select the other. So Klosek and Dickinson did this very simple manipulation, trained the children so that they learned about pressing one butterfly to get one video clip, another butterfly to get another video clip, devalued one of the clips, and then just looked at how strongly the devaluation affected their behaviour. Were they then vastly more likely to select the other video clip or not? They had three age groups, just as you can see here. So the children who are just about 1.5 to 2, there wasn't actually a significant difference between how often the video was selected before it was devalued how often the valued video was selected versus the devalued video, right? Those two things, although it looks like there's a trend here, the valued video is being selected slightly more often, it's not statistically significant, so it's very difficult for us to draw any conclusions. Either way, right? So we don't want to say that there's no goal-directed process there, we've just got null result. By contrast, with the children who were 2 to 2.5 or 2.5 to 3, we find exactly the pattern that we would expect if their actions were strongly influenced by a goal-directed process. That's to say that they're significantly more likely to pick the valued than the devalued video after devaluation. So there's something very simple. Here's some nice evidence. Assuming that the dual process theory of instrumental action is true, we can show that from around about 2.5 years of age at the latest, we have good evidence for those goal-directed processes influencing action. We didn't find evidence that it happens earlier, although it could well be that that was a limit of the experiment rather than a defect of our subjects. All right, very good. Sorry, I do want to say this actually. I was going to skip over this, but I do want to say this. So you might be saying, good question, Steve, why is this evidence of goal-directed processes in the older age groups? And the answer is very simple. When we think about the dual process theory of instrumental action, what you notice is that changing the strength of someone's preferences by devaluing one video clip, allowing them to watch it till they're completely sated on it, changing how much they prefer that video clip, should have a strong effect on the goal-directed process, but almost no effect on the habitual process. So the fact that we do find a significant difference after devaluation points to the idea that preferences are having an effect on the instrumental action, pressing one button or another, and that indicates that the goal-directed processes are at work in those children. Very good. Now if we look at the dual process theory, the habitual processes, what explains what the action delivers is just the strength of the stimulus-action link. So you can see here what I was saying a moment ago with that diagram. When you change the preferences, that shouldn't have any immediate effect on the habitual process, because what's supposed to determine action when the habitual process, as far as the habitual process is concerned, is that stimulus-action link. So of course your preferences matter for establishing the stimulus-action link, your preferences matter for what counts as a reward and therefore whether an outcome strengthens or weakens the stimulus-action link, but they don't matter to you at the point where you're selecting the action. What matters there is the strength of the stimulus-action link itself. That's why this manipulation, where we go in and change the preferences and then see whether the action is immediately affected, is so important. On the habitual process, that change in preferences does nothing because everything depends on the stimulus-action link. And the stimulus-action link isn't somehow retrospectively updated, right? You've already received the reward, the experience of reward is already there. That's what strengthened the link. By contrast, when we get to the goal-directed process, it's just part of the idea of this process. The existence of this process is a matter of that preference having a role in your action selection. That's what the goal-directed process says. All right, good. So what we know is that from this evidence, 2.5-year-olds, perhaps even younger children, are able to demonstrate that they perform instrumental actions which are somewhat influenced by, measurably influenced by, goal-directed processes. Their actions are not merely guided by habitual processes. But I introduced that as background, and I was promising you that I would give you some more evidence for the dual process theory of instrumental action. So let's get to that. Here's the question. What happens if we train people with just one action possibility rather than two? What we're going to try to do is to run an experiment where we either train you with the contingency between action and possible outcomes, one by one, or we give you two choices simultaneously and give you the opportunity to learn about two things simultaneously. What I want to do is to derive a prediction that we get only from the dual process theory of instrumental action. No other major competing theory makes the same prediction about the effects of that difference in training regime, the one action versus two action training regime. Now this is kind of tricky here, and there's something subtle about this. So Dickinson says, look, if we create a situation where someone can only perform one action in the experiment. We basically give them one button. You can press that button and find out what happens, and that's it, right? So there are 2 buttons, but I'm going to give you a series of trials, and on each trial you're either going to press this button or do nothing, and then on another trial you might press this button or do nothing. So overall you're going to encounter all of the buttons, but you're only ever encountering them one by one. There's only ever one action. And Dickinson says, look, if you're that's the wrong button. If you're responding at a high and constant rate in the one action condition, then after extended training, you're no longer experiencing episodes in which you don't respond to that button and don't receive the outcome. You always respond by pressing that button. You're not pressing the other button and therefore not pressing this one, therefore not getting the action. And so Dickinson says, as a result, the representation of the action-outcome relation will not be maintained. So he thinks there's a good theoretical reason, and of course he's an expert, so we should trust him, right? He might be wrong, but we have to have a good argument to show that. I'm going to trust him for now. He's suggesting that in the one action case, when you are learning about the button, you're not generating the right kind of representation to enable a goal-directed process to occur. So in future, when you encounter that button, your responses are more likely to be dominated by the habitual process than they would be if you were learning about both buttons simultaneously. So the prediction is that if we devalue one of the button outcomes, let's say that just as in the previous experiment, each button gets you to see a particular video clip. So we devalue one of the video clips by allowing you to watch that until you're completely bored of it. You're sated of the video clip, completely sated. You've seen it as often as you want, and you've got no further interest in watching it. If we devalue it, Dickinson says that's going to have a smaller effect on your actions when you've been trained on the buttons one by one than when you've been trained on both buttons simultaneously. Even if we construct things so that whether you're trained in the one by one or the 2 buttons simultaneously, you actually have the same number of encounters with the buttons. You press the buttons equally often. Sorry, wrong button again. And the reason for that is that the habitual processes are supposed to be more influential in the 1 button than the 2 button training, and so devaluation will have less effect. Make sense? So what we're doing here, according to Dickinson, and I think he's probably right, is messing with the representation of action-outcome links, and that representation of action-outcome links is critical for the goal-directed process, but plays no special role in the habitual process at all, should be entirely redundant. Very good. Now, here's what happens before any of the devaluation goes on. So when you're given the 2 button task, the probability of you pressing the buttons, that's about equal. And of course, you're pressing those buttons about half as often as people in the 1 button situation because you only have 1 of 2 buttons to press. And what you're seeing here, then, they're not actually at 1.0. There's a proportion of trials, about a third of trials, in which no button was pressed for these subjects. And it's about the same for these, actually. So these subjects sometimes just didn't press a button, didn't participate at all. But when they did participate, they pressed the buttons roughly equally often. Very simple, that's all we're looking at so far before. Now, what happens when we devalue? What happens when we devalue one of the buttons, but now we give people the opportunity to press either of the buttons? So whether or not you're in the 2 button or the 1 button condition, you're now going to be presented with the 2 buttons and you can press either, but we're doing this in extinction. So you're not going to have a chance to encounter the video clips. You're going to press those buttons, but we're doing it in extinction, so nothing will happen when you press the buttons. We just want to see how often you press the buttons. And here what's interesting is that the people in the choice condition who'd been given a choice of 2 buttons to press during the training are pressing the valued button 4 more than the devalued button, whereas the people in the single action condition are not doing that. They're pressing both buttons roughly as often. So what this suggests is that in the single action case, the habitual processes are dominating, whereas in the choice case, the goal-directed process is comparably more influential. So here's an interesting practical point. Whether you learn about the effects of an action for example, by giving a choice of actions and then seeing what different actions do, or just by giving one action where you're much less likely to learn about what happens if you don't perform the action, influences whether that action becomes dominated by instrumental or habitual processes. So you can design learning situations to create the possibility that your actions in future will be dominated more by the habitual processes, which can kind of be useful in the context of, say, exercise, or will be dominated more by the sort of goal-directed processes, which would be a useful thing in the case of, for example, watching video clips that are entertaining, not like this one, of course. So this tells you something about how things like TikTok might be designed, why they might be designed in the way that they are, and why giving people more choices might actually make those things less effective. But of course, our concern isn't with these practical matters. I did once spend an evening on TikTok actually when I was preparing to give online lectures. I thought I'll try to work out how to give captivating lectures by looking at things on TikTok, and it was just a very strange evening, and I just deleted that app, and I don't ever want to experience that again. I can't remember anything at all about it. It's a complete blank, but I just remember it as this kind of extremely strange situation where I was locked into some kind of weird world, and I didn't really learn how to give good online lectures by doing that, so I just moved off from that. So we're not going to talk about TikTok anymore. Gosh, that must be some kind of habitual response in me. Sorry about that. Right, it's like a stimulus response thing, you know. What we're interested in, this is kind of fascinating. It has practical applications. What we're interested in is evidence. Why is this, the one button versus two button finding, evidence for the dual process theory of instrumental action? Very simple. Only the dual process theory of instrumental action, none of the major known competitors, can generate the prediction that devaluation will have less effect when your training doesn't expose you to the full range of contingencies, when you're trained each button in its outcome separately versus two buttons together. Right? Only the dual process theory can make that prediction. That prediction is confirmed, therefore we're more likely to, therefore we think that the dual process theory of instrumental action is more likely to be true. Now just here there is a kind of interesting catch. There is an interesting catch, and the catch has to do with the status of those representations of action-outcome relations, which so far I've supposed are equivalent to beliefs about what will happen when a certain action occurs. I'm going to leave it to you for the question time to raise an interesting question about that. If you have a question around here, there are lots of interesting questions here, and I hope that this could be one of the things that comes up in the question time associated with the lectures this week. But for now, let me give you very briefly a third kind of evidence for the dual process theory of instrumental action. Here's some evidence from neurophysiology. But here I'm going to make things extremely simple. I'm not going to look in detail at the experiments. I'm just going to look at an overview of what has been discovered that's due to Tony Dickinson. So Dickinson in his overview says, look, if you go to the prefrontal cortex, there are two sites that you can lesion, right? The prelimbic or the infralimbic. And what we have found, according to Dickinson, is that if you lesion the prelimbic, you will have a stronger effect on habitual processes, and if you lesion the infralimbic, you will have a stronger effect on goal-directed processes. Sorry, I got that back to front, didn't I? If you're reading along here, you can see that I've got that back to front. Well done me. And well done you for spotting that. So that, of course, suggests that different neural circuits mediate the two forms of control, habitual and goal-directed. Now, I don't think it's essential that this be true for us to accept the dual process theory of instrumental action. The dual process theory, in and of itself, doesn't involve commitment to there being separate neural circuits. On the other hand, the fact that there are, according to this, distinctive neural circuits that can be selectively impaired, giving us this kind of dissociation between the habitual and the goal-directed, well, that does suggest that the theory must be true. So this also counts as evidence for the theory. So where are we? What I've offered are 3 bits of evidence for the dual process theory of instrumental action, one involving manipulations of cognitive load, one involving manipulating whether or not you can represent the action-outcome contingency, and the last one that you've just seen as involving the neurophysiology. My suggestion to you is that taken together, this provides all but compelling evidence for the dual process theory of instrumental action. To my knowledge, there is no significant body of evidence against that theory, and so I therefore propose that we can, as a working hypothesis, accept that the theory is true, at least unless somebody comes up with strong evidence against it.